Hello and welcome to Basics for Gamers presents Magic and Pathfinder Part 4, Spell Components. Spell components are sort of like the fuel a spell needs to work. What exactly does the caster need to do in order to cast the spell? There are 4 kinds of spell components: material, somatic, verbal, and focus. Material components are small amounts of a physical substance that are consumed and lost in the casting of a spell. The caster must have a free hand to manipulate the material, but doing so is included in the spell's action cost and does not require an additional extra action to be spent. Also, in 2nd edition, the specific materials you need are usually not stated in the spell's description and are left for each player to determine themselves, which gives a lot of room for fun role-playing and individualization. For example, Summon Animal requires a material component but does not state what it is. So this is up to the player to figure out. Maybe they weave little animal figurines out of grass and string as part of their daily preparations, and when it comes time to cast, they pull a little grass fox out of a pouch and is consumed in a burst of magical green flame as part of the summoning process. If the spell lists a material component, but no value or specifics about it, then it's assumed that the material component is something inexpensive and included in material component pouches that can be purchased in most settlements for 5 silver pieces. In most cases, if the caster has a material component pouch, then they should be able to cast most spells that require a material component. But some spells like Raise Dead state what the required materials are. In this case, it's included in the spell's cost heading. To cast Raise Dead, you need material components including diamonds worth 200 gold pieces per level of the character being raised. These are not provided by material component pouches and are consumed and lost in the casting of the spell. The second spell component is somatic. Somatic is just a fancy word that refers to a person's physical body. In the case of Pathfinder, a somatic component usually refers to physical movement, such as intricate finger gestures like Dr. Strange would use or pointing towards your target. Oddly enough, you do not need to have a free hand in order to cast a spell with somatic components. It is possible to cast these spells while holding something in each hand, such as holding a wand that you would wave and point at a target instead of your finger. And if a spell requires you to touch a target, you must be able to touch them with part of your hand even if it is holding something, but it does not need to be a bare hand. You could wear gloves or gauntlets and still make touch attacks. The next spell component is verbal. This one is pretty self-explanatory. As part of casting a spell, you must say something aloud. For divine spells, this might be a prayer. For arcane casters, it might be yelling Shazam or Expecto Patronum. As with other components, the spell description does not detail exactly what you need to say, but you must say something and in a loud, strong voice that is easy to hear. And the last component is focus. A focus is like a material component or a cost, except it is not consumed in the casting of the spell. And similar to a spell's cost, foci are not listed under the cast heading, but instead are found listed under requirements. For example, in order to cast the alarm spell, the caster must have a silver bell worth at least 3 gold pieces that they use as a focus when casting the spell. In most cases, when casting a spell that requires a focus, as long as you have one hand free, you can retrieve the focus, cast the spell, and then stow it again, all as part of the actions normally used to cast the spell. You do not need to spend one action first to retrieve the focus, and then spend the number of actions listed in the spell description to cast, followed by yet another action to stow the focus. But there are a few exceptions to this, which brings us to component substitutions. Some classes allow you to substitute one spell component for another. Bards, for example, can cast occult spells by playing a musical instrument. When doing so, the instrument becomes a focus and takes the place of material, somatic, or verbal components, but cannot be retrieved and stowed for free like most foci are. And although not spelled out in the rules, many people, myself included, believe that this kind of substitution for a material component does not remove the need for any costs or other requirements listed in the spell's description. For example, Continual Flame has a cast time of 3 actions, requires material, somatic, and verbal components, and has a material cost of 6 gold pieces worth of ruby dust. A bard may play their flute using that as a focus to replace the need for material, somatic, and verbal components. But the cost and requirement fields are separate from the spell's components, so this bard would still need to provide 6 gold pieces worth of ruby dust. Likewise, clerics and druids may use a religious symbol or holy text in the case of clerics, or a primal focus such as mistletoe for druids as foci to replace a material component. But they still need to perform any somatic or verbal components that are required. Similar to bards who substitute their instrument for a material component, I do not believe the intent here is to allow a cleric to cast Raise Dead without providing hundreds of gold pieces worth of diamonds. And when a sorcerer casts a spell from their Bloodlines tradition, they can substitute an extra somatic component for any of the spell's material components. Other spellcasting classes may have options for substituting components as well, but I'm going to stick with those for now. I'll save the full discussion on how each class handles this for future class-specific videos. So why all of this fuss over component substitution if on the surface it doesn't appear to make any real difference in the casting of the spell? The spell still costs the same number of actions, and you still need to provide expensive materials listed as the spell's cost. So why bother with substituting components? Well, the first reason is for role-playing. It may be more fun for a bard to describe playing their instrument to cast a spell than setting it down to get the material component out and manipulate it. Another reason is because of free hands. You have to have one free hand when casting with a material component, but do not for somatic components. So a sorcerer would be able to cast a spell that normally requires a material component without needing to have a free hand. And it might also be handy for situations where characters have limited access to their gear, like being in a jail cell, if a bard can convince the guard to give them their harmless flute, or if they let a cleric keep their holy book, then those characters have all of the materials they need to cast their spells. But I'll also be the very first to say that the benefits of substituting components feels very limited compared to the amount of attention these get in the rules, so let me know in the comments if you found a creative use for substituting components in your games. And the last piece about spell components that we need to cover is how a spell's traits change depending on what components are used to cast it. Each spell lists their regular traits in the description. For example, Continual Flame has the evocation and light traits by default, but each spell component may add more traits to it. Spells using material, somatic, or focus components add the manipulate trait to the spell, and spells cast using the verbal component gain the concentrate trait. These extra traits are important when casting spells while affected by certain conditions. If you try to cast a spell using a material, somatic, or focus component while grabbed, that spell now has the manipulate trait, meaning you have to pass a DC 5 flat check or the spell is lost. This also means you can't cast one of these spells while restrained. Any spell cast with a verbal component gains the concentrate trait, so you might not be able to cast those while fascinated. Also, any spell that has a verbal component can't be cast if you can't speak. And when you use component substitution, the traits change accordingly. When a bard uses their instrument as a focus, that spell gains the auditory trait, which means any target that cannot hear it is immune to the spell. And it also makes those spells susceptible to another bard's counter performance. Before we close, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our patrons. These videos would not be possible without their continued generosity and support. Members of the Basics for Gamers Patreon community receive special benefits, like getting to vote on the topics that we cover in the future, and also they get to see these videos 1 week and ad-free before everybody else. Visit the link shown on the left of the screen and in the description if you'd like to know more about becoming a patron. If you would like to support this channel and help it grow, the easiest way to do that is by subscribing and clicking the bell icon so you get notified when new videos release. And we can always be reached through our Twitter and Facebook pages too. Thanks for watching, take care, and we will see you soon with more basics of Pathfinder.